My name is Wendy Thomas, and I am 29 years old. For 6 years, I have worked as a registered trauma and critical care nurse at St. Catherine's Hospital in suburban Pennsylvania. Let her go. We aren't going to pay for another expensive surgery, my father said calmly to the attending trauma surgeon while I lay trapped in a deep, medically induced coma, mechanical ventilation tubes forced down my throat, my heart monitor beeping in a faint, erratic rhythm. He uttered those horrifying words with the exact same casual, unbothered tone a person uses when cancelling an unwanted magazine subscription. There was no hesitation in his voice, no tremble in his hands, and not a single tear in his eyes. He signed the formal "Do not resuscitate" order at precisely 11:18 on a rainy Tuesday night. He did not do it because the medical team told him that my brain was dead or that my broken body was beyond clinical salvage. He signed my death warrant because the hospital's billing coordinator gave him an estimated out-of-pocket figure. That was all it took for my biological father to discard my life, a line item on an estimate sheet. When I finally opened my eyes 3 weeks later, battered, fractured, disoriented, and barely possessing the physical strength to lift my chin off the thin hospital pillow, I discovered that signing that DNR order was not even the most depraved act Joel Thomas had committed while his youngest daughter lay unconscious. What I uncovered in the days that followed didn't just permanently shatter the illusion of our family, it set off a chain of events that completely dismantled his entire manufactured reputation. And he never saw the reckoning coming, because he had spent 29 years making the fatal mistake of underestimating the daughter he treated like an unpaid debt. To understand why a father could look at his dying daughter and calculate the cost of her funeral versus the cost of her life, you have to go back to the very beginning of my childhood. I was born with a severe congenital heart defect, a massive ventricular septal defect, which the pediatric cardiologists described as a literal hole between the pumping chambers of my heart. When I was 4 years old, a surgical team cracked open my tiny sternum and spent 11 grueling hours repairing the defect. The surgery successfully saved my life, but the resulting hospital invoices became a permanent emotional weapon that my parents wielded against me for the next 2 decades. My mother learned to stop mentioning it over time, but my father never let a single day pass without reminding me of the price tag attached to my breath. Do you have any idea how much money you cost this family, Wendy? I was only 8 years old the first time he looked down at me and spoke those exact words. It was an ordinary autumn afternoon, and I had timidly asked him for a replacement pair of school sneakers, because the rubber soles on my old hand-me-downs had split completely down the middle, causing muddy rainwater to soak through my socks every time I walked to the bus stop. My father was sitting at the laminate kitchen table, surrounded by a mountain of past-due envelopes and bank ledgers. He didn't even look up from his papers to inspect my ruined shoes. $214,000, he stated in a cold, matter-of-fact voice. That is the exact financial damage your broken heart caused this household. You nearly bankrupted us before you even learned how to multiply. I didn't get the sneakers. I walked to school with cardboard folded inside my soles to keep out the wet chill. By the time I turned 12, I had completely conditioned myself to stop asking for anything that cost money. If I needed winter gloves, a graphing calculator, or new binders for the school year, I simply went without until I could find a solution on my own. By 15, I was babysitting for 3 different families on our suburban street, working 4 nights a week after completing my homework, just to afford my own feminine hygiene products and basic school supplies. When I turned 18 and graduated near the top of my high school class, I signed my very first independent student loan promissory note entirely alone in the financial aid office, while my parents proudly paid for every single cent of my older sister Meredith's tuition, housing, meal plans, and sorority dues at the flagship state university. Nobody in our extended family ever questioned the glaring disparity. Meredith was the golden child, the charismatic, beautiful, effortless daughter who never carried a medical complication or an awkward burden. Meredith was gifted a brand new car on her 16th birthday, I rode the county transit bus with a laminated monthly pass I purchased with my babysitting money. Meredith had her college fully funded with zero debt. I accumulated tens of thousands in loans and worked overnight shifts at the campus library. Meredith enjoyed elaborate, catered birthday dinners at downtown steakhouses. I received a boxed sheet cake from the grocery store and a birthday card signed exclusively by my mother. And the most heartbreaking part of that entire dynamic was that I accepted every bit of it without resentment. For years, I genuinely believed I was the guilty party. My father had repeated the refrain so relentlessly, "You cost this family everything, Wendy," that the manufactured financial debt felt as permanent, heavy, and undeniable as the jagged surgical scar running down the center of my chest. I carried that burden into adulthood the exact same way I pinned my registered nurse badge to my scrubs every morning, automatically, silently, and without question. The single human being in my entire world who never once mentioned that debt, and who never made me feel like an emotional liability, was my maternal grandmother, Lillian Price. Lillian lived entirely alone in an unassuming, sturdy red brick cottage on Elm Street in Norristown, Pennsylvania. The house had 2 modest bedrooms, a single bathroom with vintage floral wallpaper, and a creaking wooden porch swing that gently rocked whenever the summer breeze blew through the oak trees. She had lived in that home for 41 years, having raised my mother within its walls, buried my grandfather Walter from its front parlor, and lovingly tended a vibrant perennial garden through 4 decades of harsh Pennsylvania winters. When I graduated from nursing school at 23, overwhelmed by exhaustion and drowning in clinical shifts, I made a personal promise to drive 40 minutes to Norristown every single Saturday morning. I would bring her fresh groceries, check her resting blood pressure, manage her heart medications, weed her garden beds, and sit beside her on that weathered porch swing listening to her tell stories about the past. She never once uttered a transactional word to me. She never made affection conditional upon performance. She would simply take my tired hands in her warm, wrinkled palms and ask, "Tell me about your hospital floor, sweetheart. Did you eat a proper lunch today? Are you taking care of your own heart while you fix everyone else's?" During one of my final visits in early spring, when her congestive heart failure had begun to slow her steps and her voice had dropped to a soft, raspy whisper, she gripped my fingers with unexpected firmness and said something that puzzled me. "I have taken care of everything for you, Wendy. When the time comes, a man named Kessler will find you. Remember that name, Donald Kessler." I smiled gently, kissed her forehead, and assumed she was experiencing a fleeting moment of medication-induced confusion. She was 84 years old, and I foolishly wrote off the comment as the rambling of an aging mind. My father openly despised my weekly visits to Norristown, sneering that I was wasting gasoline on an old woman who barely remembered my name. But that was a blatant lie. Lillian Price remained razor-sharp until her final heartbeat, remembering every detail of our family's history, especially the selfish tendencies my father desperately wished everyone would forget. Grandma Lillian passed away peacefully in her sleep on a rainy Thursday in late March. My father immediately took control of the arrangements, keeping the funeral service remarkably small, hurried, and sterile. When I asked if I could stand up and read a brief eulogy in honor of the grandmother, who had practically raised my spirit, he blocked the chapel door and snapped, "Keep your seat, Wendy. We aren't turning this into an emotional spectacle." I sat in the very last pew of the chapel, weeping in absolute silence, completely unaware that Lillian's mention of Donald Kessler was about to become the single most important lifeline of my existence. 3 months after Lillian's funeral, on a dark, wet Tuesday at 4:17 in the morning, I was driving home along Route 202 following a grueling 12-hour night shift in the intensive care unit. The asphalt was slick with summer rain, and I remember staring at the digital dashboard clock, calculating how many hours of sleep I could squeeze in before reporting back to the hospital for my next shift. 5 hours if I skipped breakfast, 4 if I took a shower. I never finished that mental calculation. An oncoming heavy pickup truck ran a red light at 50 miles an hour, T-boning my small sedan directly on the driver's side. The impact was catastrophic. The metal frame crumpled inward like wet cardboard. The trauma surgeons operated immediately to relieve massive intracranial swelling, repair 4 shattered ribs, and control severe internal abdominal hemorrhaging. But my vascular system was failing, and the surgical team determined that an emergency secondary procedure was required within hours if I was to survive the night. Because I was unmarried and had no children, the hospital's electronic intake system pulled my primary next-of-kin contact, a designation that Joel Thomas had forcefully insisted remain in place since I turned 18. The hospital administration telephoned him at 10:30 p.m. Joel Thomas arrived at the emergency department at 10:47 p.m. He did not rush to the intensive care unit. He did not ask the charge nurse if I was breathing, if I was in pain, or if I had shown any signs of neurological responsiveness. Instead, he walked straight to the administrative financial desk and demanded to know the exact out-of-pocket projection for the specialized surgery. Patricia Walsh, our veteran head nurse with 28 years of trauma experience, known to everyone on the floor as Pat, stood behind the central nurses station and witnessed the entire interaction. Dr. Richard Hale, the lead trauma surgeon on duty, stepped out of the surgical suite and explained the clinical reality. The second procedure would cost between $180,000 and $240,000 depending on postoperative complications. While my employee medical insurance would absorb a significant portion, there remained a substantial personal deductible and co-insurance balance. Because Gerald had historically co-signed certain legacy medical accounts from my childhood, he feared that my ongoing trauma care would ultimately be billed against his personal assets. My father did not blink. He looked Dr. Hale dead in the eye and stated, "Wendy does not have an executed healthcare proxy on file. As her biological father and legal next of kin, I am the sole medical decision-maker. Do not take her back into that operating room. Let her go. We are not paying for another surgery. She has been a financial drain on this family her entire life. Give me the do not resuscitate paperwork." Pat stood behind the counter, her knuckles turning bone white, as she watched Joel Thomas calmly accept a black ballpoint pen, sign the DNR form without a single second of hesitation, hand the clipboard back to the clerk, and walk toward the parking garage elevators without ever stepping foot inside his daughter's room. He did not look through the glass window. He did not whisper a goodbye. He walked away into the rainy night fully convinced that my cardiac monitors would be silenced within hours. Joel Thomas went home and slept soundly, completely unaware that Pat Walsh had already begun moving behind the scenes. Pat knew the administrative protocols of St. Catherine's better than anyone. The moment the elevator doors closed on my father, Pat sat down at her terminal and pulled my confidential employee human resources file. Every registered nurse on staff completes a mandatory emergency onboarding packet upon hire, which includes an optional legal healthcare proxy designation. 3 years prior, knowing my father's toxic nature, I had formally executed my durable healthcare proxy, naming my closest nursing school friend, Deborah Owens, as my sole medical agent. Deborah lived 45 minutes away in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Pat dialed Deborah's personal number at 11:14 p.m. Deborah answered on the second ring, grabbed her certified proxy paperwork from her home safe, and sped through 90 minutes of torrential rain to reach the hospital at 12:51 a.m. Standing in the trauma bay with trembling hands, Deborah presented her legal documentation, immediately revoked my father's fraudulent DNR order, and signed the emergency surgical consent forms. Dr. Hale scrubbed in within the hour. By dawn, the internal bleeding was successfully arrested. Pat then sat down in the quiet break room and filed an extensive, time-stamped internal incident report, meticulously documenting Joel Thomas's exact verbal statements, his false claim regarding the absence of a proxy, and his attempt to terminate his daughter's life over an estimated medical bill. While I lay in a coma over the next 3 weeks, my father committed his second, catastrophic crime. Believing that I would either die or remain permanently institutionalized, he set his sights on my late grandmother's estate in Norristown. What Gerald did not realize was that Grandma Lillian had already transferred the full legal deed of the Elm Street house into my name prior to her death through her private attorney. Knowing only that the house was physically vacant, Gerald used an old medical consent document to meticulously trace and forge my signature onto a fraudulent general power of attorney. He took the forged document to a corrupt local notary named Carl, who owed him personal favors, had it illegally stamped, and recorded the fraudulent deed transfer at the county courthouse. Within 48 hours, Gerald walked into a regional lending bank and secured an immediate cash-out mortgage against my grandmother's house for $280,000, money he instantly funneled into covering his secret, catastrophic gambling debts. When I finally woke from the coma 3 weeks later, Pat sat beside my bed during shift change and delivered the unvarnished truth about the DNR order. The room fell into an eerie, suffocating silence as the realization settled into my bones. My father had actively tried to end my life to avoid a bill. I reached for my bedside phone, ignored 32 missed calls from my father, and dialed the contact number my grandmother had given me on her deathbed, Donald Kessler. When the distinguished probate attorney answered, his voice carried the calm authority of an expert. "Miss Thomas, I have been searching for you for months. Your grandmother left you the entire Norristown estate and an $85,000 liquid trust under a sealed will probated 5 months ago. But someone recently recorded a fraudulent power of attorney and encumbered your property with a massive $280,000 mortgage." Holding the receiver against my ear, staring at the steady drip of my 4-line, I felt every trace of childhood guilt and manufactured obligation permanently evaporate from my soul. I wasn't just a survivor of a car crash. I was a woman holding the receipts to my father's destruction. I requested a copy of Lillian's sealed letter, coordinated with Kessler to prepare emergency court filings to void the fraudulent deed and notify the bank's criminal fraud division, and began laying the groundwork for a public reckoning. My father had spent 15 years serving as a prominent, respected deacon at First Grace Community Church, preaching sermons about family sacrifice and Christian charity to a congregation of 120 people who viewed him as a pillar of righteousness. He had scheduled a grand testimony at the upcoming First Sunday Fellowship dinner to celebrate my miraculous recovery. I resolved to give him the exact stage he wanted and reveal the monstrous truth in front of every single witness he cared about. The sterile, white ceiling of my hospital room vibrated with the quiet humming of my intravenous pumps, as Donald Kessler promised to meet me at my bedside at 9 o'clock the following morning. When I disconnected the call, Pat Walsh remained standing silently by the window, her arms crossed over her navy scrubs, watching the emotional shift settle across my bruised features. For 29 years, I had allowed Gerald Thomas to define the boundaries of my worth, absorbing his relentless reminders of my childhood medical debt like an obedient servant paying off an unpayable loan. But sitting in that elevated hospital bed, nursing 4 fractured ribs and a healing incision down my abdomen, I felt the final fragments of filial loyalty turn to cold, indestructible steel. My father had stood in this very hospital, looked upon his dying daughter, and attempted to discard my life to protect his personal assets, before turning around and stealing the physical sanctuary my grandmother had built for me. I pulled out a legal notepad from my bedside drawer, uncapped a pen with steady fingers, and began outlining the exact sequence of evidence we would present to dismantle his public empire. Gerald Thomas arrived at St. Catherine's the following afternoon carrying a bouquet of yellow roses and a container of homemade banana bread that Meredith had baked for my recovery. He walked across the room, with the heavy sigh of an exhausted patriarch carrying the weight of the world, placing the gifts on the side table before leaning down to press a warm kiss against my forehead. I watched his face with clinical precision, reading the subtle micro-expressions around his eyes the way trauma nurses monitor shifts in neurological function. He took my hand, squeezing it with rehearsed tenderness, and looked down at me with watery eyes. "The doctors informed us that you should be cleared for discharge within a week, sweetheart," Gerald whispered, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Do not spend a second worrying about the hospital invoices. Meredith and I are going to handle every detail as a family." That is simply what families do. Hearing that monstrous phrase uttered by the very man who had signed a "do not resuscitate" order over my unconscious body nearly made me laugh out loud. I looked into his eyes, smiled with absolute calm, and replied, "Thank you so much, Dad. We will handle everything as a family." He smiled back, completely satisfied, convinced that his quiet daughter was safely trapped inside his narrative. Meredith had accompanied him for that visit, marking her first appearance at my bedside since the collision on Route 202. She stood stiffly at the foot of my bed, her designer handbag clutched across her chest, checking her smartphone every 30 seconds with nervous agitation. Her smile was tight, strained, and failed to reach her eyes, deflecting my gaze toward the window whenever I looked in her direction. "We were so desperately worried about you, Wendy," Meredith muttered, tapping her manicured nails against the footboard. "I could barely sleep for weeks thinking about the accident." I watched my older sister in total silence, noting the subtle tension in her jaw, and the way she deliberately avoided stepping close to my monitors. After 40 minutes of hollow pleasantries regarding local weather and plumbing jobs my father had completed over the weekend, Gerald stood up, patted my blanket, and led Meredith out the door. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, the room returned to absolute quiet. I sat upright, ignored the sharp protest of my bruised ribs, and dialed Donald Kessler to confirm our morning appointment. Donald Kessler arrived at my hospital room promptly at 9 o'clock the next morning, carrying a worn leather briefcase that had witnessed decades of legal battles. He was a compact, silver-haired gentleman in a tailored charcoal suit and wire-rimmed glasses, possessing the calm demeanor of an attorney who measured his words with absolute precision. He pulled a chair beside my bed, shook my uninjured right hand with gentle warmth, and opened his briefcase on the rolling tray table. "Your grandmother Lillian spoke about your resilience during every single consultation we held, Miss Thomas," Kessler said softly, his voice carrying the quiet resonance of a trusted friend. He retrieved a sealed manila envelope bearing Lillian's distinctive cursive script across the front, "To my Wendy." With trembling fingers, I broke the wax seal and unfolded the sheet of yellow legal paper contained inside. The handwritten letter from my grandmother read like a sacred blessing across the page, "Wendy, my darling girl. If you are reading these words, it means that my time on this earth has drawn to its close, and that you have found yourself in the storm I knew was coming. I know with absolute certainty that your father will attempt to seize every asset I leave behind, just as he spent decades quietly draining my personal pension, my savings, and my peace of mind. For years, I remained silent to keep the peace and prevent our family from fracturing. That silence was my greatest failure in life. Wendy, please do not make the same mistake I made. The house on Elm Street belongs entirely to you. The $85,000 in the private trust belongs entirely to you. Mr. Kessler holds every legally binding document in his vault. Do not allow anyone to steal what you have rightfully earned through love and loyalty. Not Meredith. Not your father. Especially not your father. You possess a strength far greater than mine, sweetheart. Claim your life, stand in the truth, and never apologize for surviving." Tears streamed silently down my cheeks as I pressed the letter against my chest, feeling the profound love of an 84-year-old woman who had planned my defense long before I knew I was in danger. When I wiped my eyes, Kessler placed an evidentiary binder flat on my blanket containing the certified original probate decree confirming my sole ownership of the Norristown cottage, the county land records demonstrating the fraudulent deed transfer executed under my forged signature, the bank records showing the $280,000 cash-out mortgage Gerald had extracted, and the state licensing number of Carl, the corrupt notary who had facilitated the transaction. "Miss Thomas, every document in this binder constitutes prima facie evidence of aggravated felony forgery, identity theft, and grand larceny, Kessler explained calmly. We can file emergency criminal charges with the district attorney's office this very afternoon. I looked at Kessler, took a deep breath, and shook my head. No, Mr. Kessler. A private courtroom filing allows him to manufacture excuses and hide behind his church reputation. I want this executed publicly, completely, and in front of every single person who believes he is a man of God. We do it this Sunday at First Grace Community Church. Kessler raised an eyebrow, closed his briefcase with a sharp click, and nodded in approval. I will see you at the Fellowship Hall at 11:30 sharp. 5 days after waking from the coma, the hospital medical board authorized my physical discharge. I was still physically battered, my ribs throbbed with every breath, and dark yellow bruises covered my arms and collarbone, but I possessed the ability to walk independently and think with total clarity. Gerald arrived at the hospital lobby at 10 o'clock on Friday morning carrying a large travel suitcase, announcing in his commanding tone that I would be staying under his roof for the next 2 months of physical rehabilitation. When I politely informed him that my best friend Deborah Owens was picking me up to stay at her guest apartment in Cherry Hill, his face darkened instantly, the mask of the doting father slipping into a cold scowl. You would honestly prefer to stay with a complete outsider rather than your own biological family after everything we have sacrificed for you? He snapped. I looked him straight in the eyes and replied, Deborah has served as my legal healthcare proxy, an emergency contact for 3 years, Dad. She is hardly an outsider. A flicker of panic flashed behind his eyes, but his arrogance prevented him from connecting the dots. He turned on his heel, threw the empty suitcase into his truck, and sped away. First Grace Community Church was situated along a tree-lined boulevard in an affluent suburb west of Philadelphia. It was a traditional red brick sanctuary, with a towering white steeple, polished oak pews, and a congregation of over 120 prominent local families, small business owners, school board members, and retirees. For 15 continuous years, Gerald Thomas had reigned as the most influential deacon in the parish. He greeted families at the double doors every Sunday morning, read scripture passages from the brass pulpit with booming conviction, led the men's charity breakfasts, and organized community repair drives. Whenever a struggling widow's furnace broke down in winter, Gerald would fix the heating pipes free of charge, ensuring that every deacon heard about his Christian benevolence. Pastor David routinely referenced Gerald in sermons as the gold standard of Christian fatherhood and sacrificial faith. The first Sunday of every month was reserved for the church's massive fellowship potluck in the lower banquet hall, a public event where Gerald consistently held court at the standing microphone to share testimonies of family blessings. Sunday morning arrived with crisp, brilliant autumn sunlight illuminating the church stained glass windows. I dressed in simple black trousers and a tailored white button-down blouse, wearing no jewelry except for the delicate silver stud earrings Grandma Lillian had gifted me on my 21st birthday. I carefully placed the master evidence binder inside my leather tote bag and rode with Deborah to the church, arriving while the main worship service was concluding in the sanctuary above. Donald Kessler was already waiting patiently beside the flagpole in the parking lot, holding his leather briefcase with the quiet discipline of a veteran litigator. When the sanctuary bells tolled noon, the heavy oak doors opened, and 120 parishioners filed into the spacious fellowship hall, taking their seats around long folding tables draped in white cloths, surrounded by steaming casserole dishes and platters of baked ziti. Gerald Thomas was already standing at the front of the hall beside the chrome microphone stand, beaming with proprietary pride, basking in the warm greetings of his fellow deacons. When the room settled and the chatter died down, Gerald tapped the metal microphone with his index finger, cleared his throat, and looked out across the crowded room with a sorrowful expression. Good afternoon, my dear brothers and sisters in Christ, Gerald began, his voice dropping into that deep, trembling register he reserved for emotional manipulation. Before we break bread together today, I must share an extraordinary testimony of God's miraculous grace. As many of you know, my youngest daughter, Wendy, was involved in a horrific car accident 4 weeks ago. She was trapped in a coma, her body shattered, and the medical specialists prepared us for the worst. But as a father, I refused to surrender hope. I spent every night on my knees beside her hospital bed, praying over her broken body, refusing to leave her side. And today, by the grace of the Almighty, my precious daughter is standing right here with us. Gerald dramatically extended his open arms toward the back of the hall, pointing directly at me as the entire room of 120 people erupted into passionate applause. I walked slowly down the center aisle, mounted the wooden steps, and stood directly beside my father. "Dad," I said in a clear voice, "would you mind if I took the microphone to share a brief personal reflection with our church family?" Gerald beamed with absolute triumph, entirely convinced that his public coronation was complete, and handed me the microphone. I wrapped my fingers around the warm metal, took a slow breath to steady my aching ribs, and looked out over the sea of familiar faces. "Thank you all so very much for your prayers and support," I began, my voice ringing steady, resonant, and calm across the entire hall. "I am profoundly grateful to be standing here on my own 2 feet today. But as a registered trauma nurse and as a Christian, I am called to speak the absolute truth, and I must correct the testimony that my father just delivered to this congregation." The warm smiles across the room began to freeze as Gerald's expression stiffened. "My father did not spend a single night praying beside my hospital bed," I continued. "He visited St. Catherine's Hospital exactly once, on the night of the crash. He went straight to the administrative financial office, asked how much my emergency surgery would cost, and when he was given the estimate, he signed a formal do not resuscitate order at 11:18 p.m., telling my trauma surgeon, 'Let her go. We are not paying for this surgery. She has been a financial drain on this family her entire life.'" An absolute, suffocating silence descended upon the fellowship hall. A ceramic casserole dish slipped from a parishioner's hands in the 3rd row, shattering against the floor with a deafening crash, as women covered their mouths in disbelief. Gerald's face turned an ashen shade of grey as he lunged toward the microphone, shouting that I was medicated and confused. Before he could utter another word, Donald Kessler strode deliberately down the aisle, stepped onto the platform, and opened the master evidentiary binder in full view of the front rows. "My name is Donald Kessler, and I served as the personal estate attorney for the late Lillian Price," the lawyer announced into the microphone. 5 months ago, Lillian Price's probated will bequeathed her entire real estate property in Norristown and her liquid trust exclusively to Wendy Marie Thomas. But while his daughter lay trapped in a coma fighting for her life, Gerald Thomas forged Wendy's signature onto a fraudulent power of attorney, transferred the deed into his personal name, and extracted an unauthorized $280,000 cash-out mortgage against the home to liquidate his personal gambling debts. The room erupted into chaos as Meredith sobbed and fled out the exit doors, while Deacon Robert Dill walked up the steps, placed a firm hand on Gerald's shoulder, and ordered him to leave the church immediately. In the 72 hours following the confrontation, Gerald's manufactured empire completely disintegrated under the weight of legal reality. The commercial lender froze the $280,000 mortgage upon receiving Kessler's fraud notice, converting the unpaid balance into a personal civil judgment against Gerald. Carl, the corrupt notary, was arrested by county detectives, signing a full confession detailing the scheme. The county court granted our emergency motion, expunging the fraudulent deed and restoring full ownership of the Elm Street cottage to my name, while the church board voted unanimously to strip Gerald of his deaconship and ban him from the premises. Stripped of his standing, Gerald's plumbing business collapsed as clients cancelled contracts. Facing felony forgery charges, he accepted a plea agreement resulting in 5 years of probation, community service, and full restitution, forcing him to sell his house at a loss and relocate to an apartment in Allentown. Meredith faced community scrutiny for remaining silent in exchange for promised cash, while I returned to nursing on day shifts. 6 weeks later, on a crisp October afternoon, I drove to Elm Street in Norristown. I parked in the gravel driveway, stepped out into the autumn air, and walked up the front steps of my grandmother's cottage. I pulled the brass key from my pocket, inserted it into the heavy oak door, and turned the lock. The familiar scent of dried lavender sachets filled the warm air as I stepped across the threshold. I walked over to the fireplace mantel, picked up the framed photograph of Grandma Lillian and me on the porch swing, and sat down in her favorite rocking chair beside the sunlit window. For the very first time in my 29 years of existence, I was standing inside a home that was wholly mine, a sanctuary built on genuine love, protected by truth, and entirely free from the shadows of guilt.